The British Archaeological Association's April lecture is given by Karl Kinsella, the current Shaftesbury Junior Research Fellow in Architectural History at Lincoln College, Oxford. Dr Kinsella is an architectural historian with a particular interest in the representation of buildings in text and image during the High Middle Ages. The work of Richard of St Victor, Honorius of Autun, and other religious thinkers of the 12th century are central to his research. He holds a DPhil from Oxford for a thesis on this subject. He's reworked this thesis into a book manuscript to be published by MIT under the title Plan and Elevation, Architectural Imagery in the 12th Century. His lecture has a similar title, Plan and Elevation, 12th Century Drawings of Architecture. It's most unfortunate this lecture could not be delivered in London, but the silver lining in this, there's always a silver lining, is that a recorded lecture has the potential to reach a wider audience. The Association is very grateful to Dr Kinsella for the work involved in this. Thank you.
Hello, and thank you for everybody for choosing to tune in to listening to this British Archaeological Association's talk on plans and elevations in 12th century Europe, and specifically in France. Before I start, I just wanted to thank John and Lloyd for asking me to give this talk a little while ago, and for Meg for showing me how to actually record this lecture via PowerPoint, which I never knew was possible. I'm very grateful, and I only hope that I can meet you all at some point in the near future when all this is over and done. Okay. For the next while, I'm going to talk about Richard of St Victor's commentary on the Book of Ezekiel, known as In Visionem Ezekialis, its Latin title. It's one of the most innovative biblical commentaries of the 12th century. Not only does Richard approach the biblical text searching for its literal meaning, which is very unusual at this point, he also included 13 plans and elevations to reinforce the very truth of his arguments. As we'll see, architectural drawings were particularly rare at this time, and to have so many contained within a single work is truly unique. Their drawings themselves are precocious examples of architectural drawings, filled with original methods for describing the form of a three-dimensional structure on the surface of a page. At some point, I think we can honestly say that these are very much not the birth of architectural drawings, but certainly we see somebody struggling trying to represent a three-dimensional structure, and to some degree successfully, and echoing the approaches that we take even today. So, In Visionem Ezekialis, this text itself is not contained to a couple of rare manuscripts. This is not an esoteric text by any means, but appears in 22 copies and 2 fragments, indicating a somewhat popular work that spread throughout Britain and France during the 12th century, and the 13th century as well, in fact. And while Richard was an Augustinian canon, which I'll go into in a second, copies of the work appear in college libraries, Cistercian and Benedictine houses as well, and it certainly implies that there was a broad interest in the subject at this time. So, to give you an overview of what we'll be talking about, my approach is to speak rather generally about the material, and then choosing to focus on particular sections and examples to draw out some of the more interesting aspects of the commentary. First, we'll quickly go over Richard's background and what was distinctive enough about 12th century St Victor, so much so that the commentary could be written there. Then we'll spend a bit of time looking at early architectural drawings to give a sense of the type of visual strategies that were used up to the 12th century. And we get to see how authors and artists struggled to represent 3 dimensions at this time. Then we'll take a closer look at 3 aspects of the commentary. There's Richard's method for determining what details he includes and doesn't include in certain drawings, and the order in which he presents his material to make his reading as effective as possible. The elevations for the gatehouse that join the different parts of the temple complex are some of the most important drawings and are thoroughly examined and used by Richard. But he seems to struggle a little, somewhat with the visual language at play here, especially when it comes to showing the interior and exterior simultaneously. We'll also take a look at Richard's Latin lexicon, and especially his use of the term plan, and what exactly he means by this, a word that we of course know and use today. Finally, while there are plenty of possible source materials from which Richard probably drew inspiration, the Jewish visual material was probably particularly important, and I want to quickly look at that and highlight it. So when I was an undergraduate, I learned, I dare say like a great many of you, that there are effectively no real technical or architectural drawings before the 13th century. All histories of the subject mention Vitruvius in the 1st century BC, as I'll go over in a second, but really get going when it comes to the 13th century, and especially these Villard de Oncourt's portfolio of architectural drawings and different figures from the beginning of the 13th century, or certainly around 1230 or thereabouts, maybe a little bit earlier than that. But this puzzled me because Villard is very comfortable using the type of visual language that we recognize today: plans, elevations, sectional elevations. Here on the right, he's shown the width of the walls, but he's also included the vaulting, the ribs on the vaulting as well. So it's a very confident use of the type of visual language that we recognize as, say, in an architectural drawing. So if this is where architectural history begins in historiography, and Villard is obviously very comfortable using it, there must be a sort of proto-history of the subject, a sort of hidden development that leads up to Villard that we've missed, or is of course no longer extant. And this question has always interested me, and it's this question that's kept me interested in thinking about Richard's work in the way that I will be discussing today. Saint-Victor itself was an Augustinian abbey situated on Paris's left bank, about a 20-minute walk southeast of Notre Dame Cathedral, and a little outside the medieval city walls. It no longer stands today. If you go there today, there is a cafe right there, the Café Saint-Victor, which I don't recommend going into. But the abbey itself was destroyed in the aftermath of the French Revolution. It was established around about 1109 by the former head of the cathedral school at Notre Dame, William of Champeaux, who wanted to prove his piety. It was then given royal recognition in 1113. So this fine pedigree allowed it to expand relatively quickly and become particularly known for its educational program, which is quite distinguished even in the context of the sort of vast expansion of humanistic thought during the 12th century in Paris. Importantly, it comprised an open school as well, so a lot of people could go to Paris and study there without joining the abbey itself. And it was certainly one of the best known schools in Paris during this time. Richard himself was born in Scotland, but probably moved to Paris at a relatively young age. He traveled there probably before 1141. Hugh of Saint-Victor, so the school's most famous member, died in 1141, and it seems likely that the intellectual debt that Richard owes to Hugh certainly implies that he met him at some point, even towards the end of Hugh's life, although we're not terribly sure about that, and there is some disagreement. Richard is known best for his work on mystical theology, but he was acutely aware of the importance of history to the biblical exegete. For Richard, and indeed for pretty much all Victorian authors of the 12th century, it was very important to understand the literal or plain or historical meaning of Scripture before you could go on to expand the spiritual or allegorical or moral dimension of Scripture. You had to be certain of this literal meaning. You had to be certain of exactly what people, what events, what objects were being described. And only then can you use that as a foundation, and that's the word Hugh uses, as a foundation for further exegesis. and even choosing to tackle Ezekiel's vision was a bold move on Richard's part. There are two substantial visions in the book of Ezekiel, and there were not very many attempts to provide a commentary on Ezekiel before Richard did his, simply because it's so difficult to do so. Richard is primarily concerned with the second vision that runs from chapters 40 to 48. And here the prophet sees a vision of the temple surrounded by three atria on the top of a mountain and also the side of a mountain. When he sees it, he's met by a man with a brazen complexion who carries a measuring rod. And this man escorts Ezekiel around the different parts of the temple complex, measuring those parts, and gives those dimensions to the reader as well. According to the prophet, the overall appearance of the temple complex is a large arrangement of buildings set on the side of a mountain with the temple itself on a plateau. There were three concentric square atria, more or less square, each of which are set aside for different people and retain the liturgical functions of Solomon's temple, which was built earlier and was destroyed before Ezekiel's time. The largest atrium encompassing in the whole complex is 600 cubits square. The middle atrium is 500 cubits, and the smallest one on a flat surface is 100 cubits. The middle atrium holds the altar used to make the sacrifices, and this atrium's western side opens into the temple's vestibule. The temple itself has two rooms on the ground floor, a larger one called the sanctum and the smallest called the sanctum sanctorum, so the Holy of Holies. There are gatehouses on three sides of each atria that facilitate movement between the different parts. Both Ezekiel and Richard describe them in some detail. Ezekiel's account is impressionistic, filled with the sizes given in cubits, but it's often confusing and difficult to follow. One is never actually sure which parts are being measured and the exact meaning of the architectural elements that Ezekiel refers to. In fact, Gregory the Great pointed out that the vision is so confused that the prophet describes a door wider than the wall to which it was supposed to be attached. And for Gregory, this wasn't a mistake. This was a sure sign that Ezekiel's words were never intended to be taken literally, only allegorically. But, as I said, enter Richard, and he, like all Victorian scholars, believed that man's inability to understand the literal meaning of Scripture was a failure on their part, not, of course, the divinely inspired authors. And he takes some time to write that people thought him foolish to undertake this project in the first place. But he promises us, ultimately will show them to be wrong. And importantly as well, Richard says why he includes the drawings in the first place. So in, say, Viard's portfolio, we don't know why they're there, but Richard is very clear about this. He tells us that everybody, no matter how simple, and that's a quote, I'm doing air quotes right now, could understand his argument. So at the end of the 12th century, Peter the Chanter, a well-known theologian in his own right, criticized the inclusion of the drawings in Visionum Ezechialis, believing them to be too much of a wasted effort and probably expense. And so we know that despite Richard's stated reasons, including such an array of visual material was somewhat controversial and probably required immense intellectual effort from Richard, which may partly explain why the work in fact was never finished. It ends with a sort of interlinear gloss of the final chapter of the vision, chapter 48. And he sort of loses steam when it comes to doing the drawings as well. With a lackluster representation of the altar, which ends up being very confused in some of the later copies. So we know why they're there. They're there so that everybody can know the truth of Richard's argument. And that's why we get them in the first place. But before we go into a bit more detail about what those drawings offer themselves, I just want to offer a bit more context, showing just how unusual it is to get Richard's drawings in the first place, considering the relatively few examples of the type that we have before the 12th century, or even in the 12th century itself. So we know that there were architectural drawings in antiquity because in the 1st century BC, Vitruvius, in his treatise De Architectura, describes in the section on the education of the architect 3 types of architectural drawings that he calls ichnographia, orthographia, and scenographia. And from his descriptions of them, they would correspond to plan, elevation, and a drawing, say, that uses perspective. And we get an indication of something like what Vitruvius had in mind, at least when it comes to ichnographia, so that there are plans. This, I've shown a few fragments from the Severn Marble Plan, or the former Urbis Romae. This was a monumental inscribed plan on stone that was 18 meters high and completed by about 211. That was on an interior wall in the Temple of Peace. And it shows the plan of the city of Rome with the columns and the walls represented using single lines or sometimes double lines. So it's broken up, so we don't have, and whether Vitruvius would have definitively identified this as an ichnographia, I don't know, but they did exist in antiquity, and this tradition certainly continued on into late antiquity and into the early Middle Ages. As an interesting example of how this tradition continued on into late antiquity and certainly was received by the early Middle Ages, I wanted to show this one, which I don't get to air out very often, but I find absolutely fascinating. This is a mosaic from the late 4th century or early 5th century that's housed at the Musée Aquitaine in Bordeaux. And it supposedly shows the Holy Sepulchre in Jerusalem. Now, the date for this is quite interesting, because if it is from the late 4th century, that would mean that it was made only a few short decades after the actual construction of the rotunda at the Holy Sepulchre in Jerusalem. So quite a short transmission period, and is definitely worthy of more study. I could talk for days about this mosaic in and of itself, but I won't. What I wanted to point out is just how interesting the way in which the artist has gone about representing the different spaces. So at the bottom half, we have these 3 concentric circles which represent the rotunda. The tomb of Christ would have been in the middle, and we can compare those 3 concentric circles with this plan of the sepulchre as provided on the right, and we see they broadly overlap. Now, perched rather awkwardly on top of that rotunda on the mosaic on the left, we have an elevation of the Martyrium Church, this basilica that was a separate building to the rotunda, but certainly in close proximity to it. We have a gable roof and then a cross at the top. Those semicircular shapes that are just above the circles seem to be the apses. And I think it is what I like to call a hybrid view. So it combines both plan and elevation in a single picture, which is, as we'll see, a pretty common strategy in the early and central Middle Ages. The representation of the sepulchre is probably one of the most common drawings that we get from this period. This is much more well known. It is by Adamnon of Iona. It appears in his work called De Loca Sancta, so on the holy places. Supposedly, Adamnon met a bishop who was washed up during his return from the Holy Land. Now, Thomas O'Loughlin has suggested, I think quite persuasively, that this bishop called Arculf is in fact not real. He never existed. He's a foil for Adamnon's witness to the Holy Land. But Adamnon tells us that when he met Arculf in his descriptions included 4 drawings of buildings in the Holy Land, and this is perhaps the most elaborate of the sepulchre. Arculf did these on a wax tablet, and Adamnon insists that he copied them accurately for us. We don't have any drawings from the 7th century, so the drawings that come from Adamnon's time, the earliest is from the 9th century, but Adamnon refers to these drawings in the text itself, so we know that we're certainly intended to be included from the beginning. But it's important to recognize here that maps on quite well to what we will be talking about Richard's drawings, is that visual representations of buildings are not just simple drawings, but they fulfill a purpose. Namely, they give a rhetorical power. They give the power of eyewitness testimony to the text itself. And as well as this, we get visual exegesis, so the ability to combine various information in different parts of the Bible into one single image, so that the viewer can look at this image and get a good idea of lots of different things in one single glance. This is a 9th century drawing from the end of the book of Armagh that appears after the book of Revelation. And the artist in this case has emphasized the gates that open into the celestial Jerusalem, and has included the information that there's an angel, that it's associated with one of the apostles, with one of the 12 tribes of Israel, and a gemstone. And all of this information is in the book of Revelation, but the artist in this case has spelled it out for us. There's no need to search for it. It's all presented to us in a single image. And this is probably one of the most well-known architectural drawings of the Middle Ages, the 9th century plan of Sangalle. And I won't go into too much information about this because there's lots and lots written on it. But one of the most distinguishing characteristics of it, I think, is both its large scale. It's also on display at the moment. You can actually go see it. So as soon as all this virus quarantine is over, I highly recommend you go to Switzerland to see it. I picked out part of the cloister there on the bottom right, and we see that on the edges that these semicircles are in fact arches. So it is a hybrid view, just like we discussed in the Bordeaux mosaic. This combination of plan and elevation into a single drawing. What's also interesting about the plan of Sangalle is the language used to refer to the drawing. The transmittal note included with it refers to the drawing as an exemplar. Now, there's a lot of literature about what that means, and I am no closer to figuring out exactly what that is, but there is a diversity of Latin words that can refer to these diagrams, architectural drawings, wherever you want to call them. And this language, I think, is very important. And when it comes to Richard, it tells an awful lot of what's happening. And then we end in the 13th century with Villard de Encores as we looked at his plans. But this just gives you an idea of how innovative it seems Villard is in how he represents architectural drawings. On the right, I have one of my favorite images in the portfolio. And it shows Reims cathedrals, both the interior and exterior simultaneously. He's juxtaposed two views beside each other, so you get a sort of a view that is impossible to see in real life, looking at interior and exterior simultaneously. It's quite extraordinary. So this collection of drawings that I've just shown you is in fact largely the amount that we know from the early Middle Ages in this diagrammatic style that we think of when we think of architectural drawings. There simply are not that many of them, which is one of the reasons why the collection in Invisium Micaelis is so unusual. You've seen that they focus on particular aspects. There is one drawing of one building, but Richard has shown us lots of drawings of lots of different buildings. And that, as you've seen, is unusual. So first we'll focus on a few of the drawings. We'll think about the way in which he orders his material. We'll look at the elevation, one of the ones you see on the left here. For the most part, we are focusing on this manuscript, this Paris, Bibliothèque Nationale Française, MS Lat 14516. And this is a very important manuscript because it was made at Saint Victor at the beginning of the 1170s. Richard died in 1173, so that probably means that Richard was alive when this manuscript was made. And if that in fact is the case, that means we can assume that he took some interest in its production, in the drawings, how they're represented, and everything else about it. So And unfortunately, the manuscript isn't complete. It's largely complete, but there are some elements missing from it. So, say here on the right, we have a plan, and there are there's no notes with it, no measurements in it, which certainly implies that not everything was completed in the manuscript. Now we look at the first three plans as they appear in the commentary. I wanted to show you them all at the same time to give you an approximate idea of the relative sizes they are to one another as they appear on the manuscript page. So on the left, this is the first plan as we see it in the commentary, and that is a little bit smaller than the second, and that second one is in turn a little smaller than the third. Now, the first plan is of the entire complex, the whole thing, all three atria presented together in, ironically enough, the smallest plan in the entire commentary. And Richard has this very interesting way of presenting his material using the drawings in a very intelligent way. So he tells us that when he's going to be speaking about Ezekiel's building, first of all, he wants to give his reader an idea of the entire thing, so that before he goes on to the particular nitty-gritty of each detail, the reader should have an idea of the whole, all three atria together in their head, and how they're arranged around one another, and the placement of the central atrium within the middle atrium here. And that is a pedagogical strategy that we will see in a few Victorine writings. This balance between accuracy and accessibility. I mean, this plan, in fact, makes little sense as a plan of three atria, because there are no openings between the atria. There's no way to get from one to the other. No representation of the gatehouses, which Ezekiel emphasizes and which Richard will go on to discuss in great detail, as we'll see. But that doesn't matter. He is focusing on the details he wants his reader to take from his drawings right now. He excludes anything that's not immediately needed, and simply wants them to think about the general arrangement of each of the atria. Then we go on to the second drawing in the sequence. Now we start to get a little bit more detail. But first of all, look at how it is arranged in comparison to the previous drawing. It's as if we've zoomed in slightly. We still get the three atria. So the middle atrium has lost its wall width. It's right there in the center, but it is there. But now this middle atria has been expanded slightly. So we get an idea of the buildings as they're arranged within that middle atrium. Now we also get the representation of the gatehouses, these porticus arranged in three sides of each of the atria. And then we get the indication that the pavimentum, so this ground that lies between all the porticus, and now we also know that there's a series of rooms extending from, as we see at the bottom, as you walk towards the central atrium, the 15 rooms, the sequence of rooms that Ezekiel describes. And then we get the most detailed drawing so far. And again, look at the general view of it. Now the outer wall is taken away. We have zoomed in even more so. It's as if we are stepping closer to the action bit by bit. The central atrium is still in the middle there. We still have the gatehouses, these porticus arranged on three sides of it, the pavimentum between them. Now we have the gazophalacia in that sort of T shape at the bottom as well. But now Richard tells us where the temple is, right there, just above the interior atrium as we see it, and it in turn is surrounded by three buildings. So there's nothing that would have stopped him from including the temple and these three buildings in the second drawing, but like in the text, Richard is taking his reader through each part bit by bit, choosing what to include and what to exclude, which is just as important, in order for his reader to focus on exactly what they should take out of it. He doesn't want to bombard them with information. He wants to take them through the buildings bit by bit, just like the man with the brazen complexion does. We also here, for the first time, get a sense of how the drawings are orientated. So if we look at the gazophylacea, these green rectangles on the bottom half, on the left, say, here we have the term australum. So we know that that is the southern part, and aquilonare on the opposite side, the north. So now we can begin to orientate ourselves around this entire structure. As I think it's important that the temple is situated where it is in relation to the viewer. It's as if we are walking towards it. We are walking towards the western end of the complex as we move towards the entrance of the temple. So I want to give a sense of the effect Richard seems to achieve here. We get a sense of moving closer to the buildings, as if zooming into the middle and central atria bit by bit, and getting more and more detail as we do. In the third plan on the right, not only are the temple and surrounding buildings included, but the outer wall is taken away. It's as if Richard adds and removes things to keep the viewer's attention on what he believes matters. Each of these drawings and the order in which they're presented fulfill a specific purpose. They are not ad hoc. They are absolutely tied to the text which accompanies them, and each one fulfills a particular function for Richard. And even these simple drawings can convey an awful lot of information, especially when combined with the text. They give a general idea of how the buildings relate to one another, and say, if we compare it to, say, something like the Sangalle plan, with that arrangement of church and cloister and all these buildings sort of very tightly contained within the spaces to an unbelievable sense, Richard is and Ezekiel is absolutely concerned with the spaces between the buildings as much as he is with the buildings themselves. And he gives so much information that I've heard mocked up a sort of, well, literally a sketch of this central atrium and what it looked. To the top on my sketch, to the top, that is the temple, and it on the three buildings on the other sides are the gatehouses. Now this isn't perfectly correct because the gatehouses are supposed to be on a slope. But if you combine the measurements given in the text with the drawings, it's very easy to make something like this from the clarity of Richard's design and the clarity of the way he conveys that design visually. Up to that point, we don't get a sense that these are actual buildings. They are simply colored polygons on the surface of a page. They're quite abstracted in how they present the material. But now, in this fourth drawing, we are shown for the first time that they are in fact buildings. These gatehouses are structures, they have roofs, they have gates, they have everything that a 12th century audience would expect from a building. Whereas before they were used, the reader was forced to use their imagination. Here, Richard explicitly shows them as buildings. Again, building up that visual language bit by bit, so that the viewer can be slowly introduced to what's happening. And of course, this fourth plan is, of course, a hybrid, like we saw with the Bordeaux mosaic, with the plan of Sangalle, and is particularly common in the early and central Middle Ages. We have the atrium wall, and then on the three sides we have the gatehouses shown in elevation. Now I'm showing this drawing out of order. It in fact appears after the elevations of the gatehouse, but I wanted to give you a sense of just how detailed and literal Richard is taking his source material here. This shows the central and middle atrium. At the top there we have the altar. It's placed right in the center of the middle atrium. The gap just above it, that is in fact the entrance to the temple. The buildings on three sides, as I'm sure you'll see, they are the gatehouses. The river that flows out of the temple goes through each of the gatehouses. Now, Richard is very thoughtful here. He's trying to take Ezekiel's words very literally. So he knows that in the gatehouses, sacrifices take place. And he also knows that if you want to sacrifice an animal, is a bit of a messy business, and that you need water in order to wash the altars and wash the spaces. Having done so, you'll see that the blue river goes through the locus coquinae in the gatehouse. So that is the kitchens. Interestingly, these kitchens should be underneath the gatehouses themselves, but Richard has presented them to the side here. I suspect this is a conceit because, as we'll see in a second, Richard really struggles with trying to portray different levels in plans. So we shouldn't really see these kitchens being placed on the side of the gatehouses, but in fact underneath them. This drawing was essentially rediscovered by Catherine Delano Smith, who kindly showed it to me a few years ago. It only exists in 2 copies of In Visionum Ezekiel. So there's this one, this French manuscript, and then in the Durham fragment as well. We know it was intended to be included from the beginning because Richard makes reference to a large drawing at the end of chapter 12. So it doesn't appear in this French manuscript that I've been using a lot, but then, as I said at the beginning, it doesn't seem that manuscript, or at least the drawings in it, are completely finished either. So we maybe shouldn't be too surprised about it. So those are the general plans of the entire structure that Richard serves in order to give the reader an idea of how the whole temple complex is ordered and how it's arranged. Now we move on to the drawings for the gatehouses themselves. And this comprises the majority of the commentary's content. He includes 5 drawings in total for the gatehouse. So we have the first 3 here that are in plan. On the left here, top left, we have the whole building. And just like the order of the plans that I discussed before, he takes us through the appearance of the gatehouse bit by bit, almost to the point of it being a little silly. So on the left, we have the entire building. It is, generally speaking, a rectangle. It's not a square. It's a rectangle with a vestibule that goes right through the middle of it. And that is generally shown to us on the top left there. And then he wants to focus on a particular part of the gatehouse. So he takes 1/2 of the gatehouse and gives us the internal structure of it. So we can see that it's divided into 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7 vestibules with smaller rooms in 3 of those middle vestibules as well. And then he gives us that, and then he gives us the entire building, which essentially just doubles the middle drawing. You just take that and sort of turn it on its side, and you get the whole building. This certainly, to me anyway, seems to indicate that Richard is thinking very thoughtfully about how he presents the material, how he is sort of gently taking the reader and the viewer by the hand and leading them through the visual material, just like, as I said, the man with the brazen complexion did as well. To give you a sense of what these larger and perhaps more important plans would have looked like if they were completed, I've shown 2 here, both from the Bodleian. The one on the right, MS Bodley 494, is a 12th century copy and is quite close to the 1170s BAA copy. But as you see, the artist here has included the different notes about the measurements for it. And the notes are important because they effectively combine text and image so that the reader doesn't have to go through the rather long chapter in order to have a good sense of what this building would have looked like. They can look at it and read these small notes to be pretty sure about what Richard is trying to argue. And in terms of the sizes of these different rooms and how they're presented on the page of the manuscript, it's quite interesting that they're not scaled. So if we look at the top of the thalami, so around here, we know that that width there is 1 cubit. So, or in fact, a better way of doing it is say this tells us that this end room is 8 cubits wide, and the threshold is 6 cubits. So we know that these jambs here on either side are 1 cubit. Now, if we take that 1 cubit and try to scale it up, so does 1 cubit fit into these 6 cubits 6 times? No. Does the 1 cubit fit into these 8 cubits 8 times? No. And the width of the vestibule that runs throughout the entire structure, that's 10 cubits wide, and that little single cubit does not fit in it 10 times exactly. However, the relative proportions are quite consistent in what they're trying to do. So 1 cubit is always smaller than 3 cubits, 6 cubits is shown smaller than 8 cubits, and 8 cubits is shown smaller than 10 cubits. So it's not scaled, but there is some concern taken with how the building appears on the manuscript, that it should be consistent in size. Now, this 12th century copy from the Bodleian is a reasonably good example of that, and not all of them do take the time to do that. Certainly, some of the 13th century copies don't. But I think with an artist who really wants to do this properly, does take the time to think about how the material is presented on the page in front of the reader. So those are the plans. Now this is the same building except shown in elevation. And these are really quite remarkable drawings in a great many ways. And I could spend an hour talking about them all by themselves. And while the plans are detailed in their own way, like so many plans, they tell us very little about how the building actually would have looked like if you were a person standing in front of them. It tells us something about how they would have looked like if we were flying on top, but little about, say, the ornament or the decoration or the style in which they could be built. So here, for the first time, we see the gatehouse, but also we see for the first time that it is situated on the slope of a mountain. And this is, as we'll see in a moment, is very important for Richard. That these steps go through the mountain, and they are on this consistent angle to it. And I don't really want to talk too much about the style. It's in Romanesque, this sort of round arches, this sort of very distinguished separation of the different elements, mainly through color for the most part. And that is always used certainly in all of the versions I've seen. There's no sort of Gothic update, version 2.0 of this manuscript. So the artists and the later artists do take some concern about being consistent into Richard's vision of it. Walter Kahn in his sort of first discussion of these drawings, first to really sort of identify just how important they are, took this frontal elevation and thought about how it reflected similar buildings from the late 12th century. And I think this is rather problematic to some degree. I don't think that Richard is thinking about his frontal elevation from the point of view of having seen buildings that look like this. I think he's thinking about it in terms of how best to represent it on the page. I think that this central vestibule going through the middle of it is not really a sort of a space between two pilasters as we see here on the left, but in fact this is sort of like a hybrid, that this is of course a frontal elevation, but this space going through the middle is probably in fact the middle vestibule that we saw in the plan that runs straight through the middle of the gatehouse. But what's really interesting about these drawings is in fact that this lateral elevation on the right here is a sectional elevation, and is, I think, one of the first one that we can definitively identify from the Middle Ages. If we look and compare these two drawings, so on the left, of course, this is the plan for the same building, that the different spaces here correspond to this space here, and so on and so forth. And we know this because it tells us that the tituli here tells us what each of these spaces represents. So unless this wall is open to the air, and I don't think it is, Ezekiel doesn't say that, and Richard certainly doesn't say that. Richard wants to show us what's on the inside of this building. And in fact, it's rather complex elevation because this ground floor on the slope is in elevation, but the top is not. This crenellation doesn't make sense if it was, say, sectioned off. This has to be on the front, on the sides of the building. So the top here is a normal lateral elevation, and the bottom here is a sectional elevation. Because the way in which Richard discusses this material is by discussing the interior of the buildings, and so as a result, he needs to show his readers and his viewers what is on the inside, but he also needs to show the building at the same time. So he's sort of forced into making this sectional elevation. But he's a little unsure about this because on the frontal elevation, it would have made sense to do something similar, but he doesn't seem to have done that. I've blown up a detail of the frontal elevation here on the left. And we hear on the left this line here, situs thalami. So this is the location of the thalamus, one of these inner rooms. And the fact that it's vertical tells us, I think, that this is the extent to which this thalami comes out. So through text instead of, say, the visual sectional elevation, Richard has shown information about the interior of the building, but you have to sort of work rather hard in order to know exactly what's going on, and it's not the most effective way of doing it, and certainly doesn't point to something like future developments in architecture drawing, such as the use of sectional elevations. I've shown this. This is the plan of the temple, simply because it's rather extraordinary building in its own right, and you can see, well, that one of the distinguishing features of Richard's text is the largely consistent nature of the different drawings across the manuscript witnesses, but that doesn't always hold for all manuscripts, that there are some important differences between them. Here on the left, the artist, this is an original manuscript, has in fact forgotten to include the altar, which says it's there, this altar in Censi, but this 13th century Cistercian manuscript has taken that and included it instead. So I think to some degree we can say that the artists copying the different parts of the drawings are not doing so passively, but are thinking about the relationship between text and image and want to make sure that the images are as complete as possible. Now I want to talk a little bit about the language Richard uses to present this material and the language, the Latin lexicon he uses to discuss them. So we talked a little bit in relation to that large, huge plan with all of the details and the river going through the different parts, that Richard really struggles with presenting a plan and trying to include information about the different levels on the same buildings. But in fact, he specifically says this. So, I mean, he says at the top, say, quite difficile, but it's actually difficult, or even in fact impossible, to represent the length, width, and height in plan under the same figure. This is an extraordinary phrase, really, for a couple of reasons. That he calls it in plan, so this he's calling the drawing a planum, in a plan under the same figure. Well, nobody before this has called drawings such as this a plan, and this fascinates me. Where did he pick up this language, this same language that we use today to refer to an architecture drawing such as this? So not only is the visual strategy that Richard uses as precocious, but also the language he uses as well. When we look for the source of Richard's use of the term plan, we don't have to go much further than medieval texts on geometry. One of the most important in that subject was Chalcidius's translation and commentary on Plato's Timaeus. Now, Chalcidius's work comprised most of what was known about Plato's own words by the 12th century. And Chalcidius says that he's going to deal with what, as I picked out here, de planis figura, so on plane figures. Then he follows that with, he's also going to discuss de solidis corporibus, so on solid figures as well. And if we read on, we realize that what Chalcidius is talking about are two-dimensional figures, so what we call squares and circles. And de solidis corporibus are those that incorporate three dimensions, so cubes and spheres. And this was picked up during the Middle Ages, used in other introduction to geometrical texts, such as those by Gerbert of Aurillac. But we don't have to look further than Saint Victor itself. Hugh of Saint Victor, Richard's mentor, wrote a treatise on practical geometry. And Hugh defines practical geometry as geometry that uses straight edges and compasses. So you have to work with your hands in order to do practical geometry for Hugh. And manuscripts of the work usually include these two-dimensional figures in the margins that help the reader follow the text. And I don't think we have to go too far to think about how Richard uses this material as well, by including drawings that help the reader follow along with his text. So this use of the term plane figure, so when Richard refers to a plane figure, he refers to a two-dimensional figure and not a three-dimensional figure. And this is part of the reason why he finds it so difficult to represent the length, width, and height, so that's three dimensions, in one figure. Under the same plan. He needs somehow, in order to do a proper literal interpretation of Ezekiel's words, to include that third dimension. And this drawing is how he gets his reader to do that. For the most part, when you read about Invision Ezekielus, this drawing is often overlooked because, let's face it, it's compared to some of the other drawings we've seen, it is incredibly boring. However, behind it is some of the most interesting intellectual tools that Richard takes advantage of in order to create his commentary in the first place. So what is happening? How does Richard include his third dimension? Well, he does it by giving two types of measurements for Ezekiel's plans, for his drawings, or for his vision. So I'll read this because it's quite important, and there's a few different parts of Invision Ezekielus that refer to this, but I'll read this one. He says, but if the eastern path from outside the wall to the site of the temple uniformly ascends, and 100 cubits lay between the ground between the two gatehouses, one will obtain no more than 80 cubits according to the plan, secundum planum. However, the surface will have 100 without a doubt. Surface, what I've called superficies here. So we have two types of measurements for the same space. There's a planar measurement, which is 80 cubits, and a superficies measurement, which is 100 cubits, so a little larger. So what exactly is this? How can you possibly have two different measurements for the same space? And this is how Richard fits in everything and how he incorporates this height, this third dimension, into his thinking. So this drawing is the key to how Richard shows how you translate from one measurement to another, how you get from a planar measurement to a surface measurement, from a planum to a superficies measurement. And that's why it's one of the more interesting in the entire text. So a plan measurement are those that assume the site on which you take that measurement is flat. And a surface measurement are those that include the slope of the mountain in that measurement. So that's why it's longer. It's sloped. And that's why, as we'll see in a moment, that the same space that seems to be covered is in fact two different cubit measurements. I'll take us through it. So first he asks his reader to draw a line with 5 even spaces in that line. Then he asks us to draw another line coming up from the 5th space there, and then separate that into 3 parts as well. Then you give each of those parts a letter so you can understand what is happening. Then you draw a line from A to K, and then finally you draw, unfortunately my circle doesn't fit into my slide, but trust me, that's a circle, and you draw a circle which shows that the length of the hypotenuse, so A to K, is the same as the length from A to F, so that flat measurement, that one at the bottom there. And this is exactly how we understand the superficies measurement. The A to K measurement, so the hypotenuse of the triangle, is that which is the slope of the mountain. The A to F is the planum measurement. So Richard tells us, let's assume that each of those spaces are 20 cubits. So A to F would be 100 cubits. A to K is also 100 cubits. And that is shown definitively because of the circle. We know that A to K and A to F is the same length. So we have a flat measurement and a slope measurement, a hypotenuse, that looks different, but in fact is the same measurement. So we have to imagine that we are standing on top of K and looking down. It would seem that our hypotenuse ends at E, so A to E, which is 80 cubits, but in fact it is the slope of the mountain, and it is A to K, and that is 100 cubits. And this drawing on the right, the artist has really tried to understand what is happening there, and the little note on the right there on the top of the hypotenuse tells us that that is the slope of the mountain. Now usually when I give this presentation, I tell people to come up to me at the end if you have no idea what I'm talking about. I do struggle sometimes with trying to explain this, but it is all there, and I encourage you to have a look at it. So we've looked closely at certain aspects of Richard's drawings. We've seen that the order in which he presents the first 3 plans is very much done for this pedagogical reason, that he includes information and doesn't include some information in order to lead the viewer gently by the hand so that they can better understand what's happening in each of the specific drawings. We've seen that he includes a sectional elevation so that both the interior and exterior can be shown at the same time in one of the possibly the first sectional elevation of the Middle Ages. Finally, we've seen that the language Richard uses, this use of the term plan to refer both to the drawing itself and to the type of measurements, is quite innovative and derives from the use of geometry. And this geometrical influence is very important and fascinating. But we have a broader influence that I think is just as fascinating, and that is from the Jewish visual exegesis and Jewish architectural representations. And we shouldn't be terribly surprised that Richard would be influenced by Jewish communities. Hugo St. Victor was particularly known to talk to rabbis when it came to understanding the Old Testament better. And in fact, St. Jerome says that if an exegete doesn't understand anything in the Old Testament, they should go to the rabbis, because they know it best. And that is exactly what Hugh did. Richard is not known so much of all the Victorines for emphasizing Jewish learning, but he certainly seems to accept it, as he did his mentor. So this plan here shows the map of the Holy Land that's described at the end of Ezekiel's vision. And the separation of the different tribes of Israel within their allotted land. The map itself doesn't appear in all copies of Envision Ezekielus, in about half. It doesn't appear in the earliest one, this BNF manuscript that we've looked so much at, but that manuscript, as we've seen, isn't complete. It Richard doesn't make any reference to this drawing, but then Richard's text isn't complete anyway. So whether Richard actually intended for this map to be included from the beginning, I'm not so sure. But certainly, as we've seen, this left manuscript, this Bodley 494, is a 12th century manuscript, and so we know that the map was part of the dissemination of the text relatively early in its transmission history. So certainly copyists found it useful, or certainly thought it should have been part of Envision Ezechielus. And this, whilst Jewish-Christian relationships during the 12th century was certainly declining, especially in the wake of the First Crusade and the extraordinary violence done upon Jewish communities in Germany and other places. One of the richest intellectual communities, Jewish communities, was in Champagne under the Rabbi Solomon ben Isaac, who died in 1105, who was better known as Rashi. Rashi wrote a commentary on Ezekiel which included several architectural plans, but also a map of the Holy Land that bears a remarkable similarity to these two. So these two maps are taken from Rashi's commentary on the book of Ezekiel, and I think you'll agree that they are strikingly like Richard's. And unfortunately, knowing how this map ended up at the end of Envision Ezechielus is problematic. I'm not sure we'll ever know exactly how that came to be, but as I said, the close ties between Saint Victor and the French Jewish communities and the use of Jewish learning within, say, Hugh of Saint Victor and especially Andrew of Saint Victor's work, and then later in the 13th century, Nicholas of Lyra, in his immensely popular work on the commentary on the entirety of the Bible, uses Jewish examples of drawings in order to show Christian readers the different parts of, say, the temple and the Levite priests and everything else. But here, having these drawings so closely tied to Envision Ezechielus certainly tells us that there are Jewish elements functioning within Saint Victor that emphasized visual exegesis within the context of a commentary on Ezekiel. There's plenty of other examples of Jewish architectural drawings, such as Maimonides, Maimonides, who's working in Egypt in the late 12th, early 13th century, that are even more probably precocious than Richard's itself. So they're functioning as part of this clerical intellectual community that accepts the power of making images within the commentary tradition. There's an awful lot more I could say about these, and I've written on the Jewish material that should be released soon enough, and where I go into a lot more detail about that and the relationship between Richard, Rashi, and Maimonides, and the extraordinary sense of visual representation and the representation of three-dimensional structures across Christian Jewish communities. As I said, for the most part, I would love to have a chat about these things to you all, and I hope sincerely that I will get an opportunity to do that. I will be at the BAA in December, I hope. And to give you a sense that this is not just a disembodied voice, this is me on the left, as I hope is obvious, and my fabulous assistant, Roland. If you have any questions about these things, I can certainly do my best to answer them if I get to an email. So I've included my email with this presentation, and I hope to continue this conversation further down the line. I hope perhaps that I've distracted you from your quarantine and lockdown situation. for at least a little while. And thank you very much for listening, and good luck.